The night was quiet, not peaceful, unnaturally quiet. The kind of silence that presses against your ears until your own breathing feels too loud. The kind of silence where thoughts echo, where doubt has room to grow. Somewhere inside that stillness, a decision had already been made, a line crossed, a life pushed towards something it could never return from. The house sat in darkness, ordinary and unremarkable. No flashing lights, no raised voices, just a structure holding secrets in its walls. From the outside, nothing suggested that this night would matter, that it would become a timestamp investigators would circle again and again, searching for meaning. But inside, time had already begun to fracture. Matthew Garner did not look like a man capable of murder. That would become the first sentence spoken by friends, by neighbors, by coworkers. Calm eyes, a steady posture, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke, who smiled politely, who blended in. He wasn't the kind of person you feared, and that perhaps was the most dangerous thing about him. Storms don't always arrive with thunder. Some gather quietly, slowly, invisibly, pressure building where no one thinks to look. This story does not begin with violence. It begins earlier, days before, weeks, maybe months. It begins with resentment left unspoken, with disappointment disguised as patience, with a marriage that from the outside still looked intact, doors still closed at night, meals still shared, but something essential had already slipped away. Matthew believed in control. He believed that life, like a machine, could be understood if you studied it long enough. That people were predictable. That emotions were variables to be managed, not forces to be feared. He believed intelligence could outmaneuver morality. That foresight could erase consequence. He planned quietly, methodically, in fragments, a thought here, a scenario there. Each one rehearsed in his mind until it no longer felt shocking, until it felt inevitable. There was no sudden snap, no dramatic moment where anger exploded into action. That's not how this crime was born. It was born through repetition, through justification, through the dangerous comfort of believing you are smarter than the rules that bind everyone else. That night there were no screams, no struggle loud enough for neighbors to hear, no scene ripped from a crime drama, just small movements. Soft footsteps, the gentle sound of doors opening and closing, ordinary sounds doing extraordinary harm. Every action felt deliberate, controlled, each choice stacked carefully on top of the last. A structure built so precisely that Matthew believed it could never collapse. With every step he moved further away from the man he once was, and closer to the person he would never escape becoming. True crime teaches us to look for monsters, obvious villains, raised voices, violent histories. But this case forces a far more uncomfortable truth. Sometimes evil wears a familiar face. Sometimes it sleeps beside you. Sometimes it speaks softly and waits patiently. Sometimes it plans. As the hours passed, Matthew believed he had succeeded. He replayed the night in his mind, searching for errors. He found none. No witnesses, no evidence, no visible mistakes. The scene looked the way it was supposed to look. The story made sense. The narrative held. In those first quiet moments after, something dangerous settled in. Relief. Not the messy kind, the clean kind. The kind that convinces you that you were right all along, that the risk was worth it, that you had done something impossible. He told himself it was over, that life would reset, that the worst part was behind him. But perfection is a lie humans tell themselves when they underestimate the weight of truth. Truth does not need noise. It does not need witnesses. It does not need permission. It exists quietly like breath under water, waiting for the moment it can rise. As dawn approached, the silence changed. It no longer felt empty, it felt heavy. The kind of quiet that watches you back. The kind that knows something you are trying very hard to forget. When the absence was finally noticed, the questions began gently. Where is she? When did you last see her? At first, Matthew answered easily, calmly. He had prepared for this. He had rehearsed these moments long before they arrived. But even the most careful script cannot account for every pause, every glance, every moment where emotion arrives uninvited. People searched, Calls were made, time stretched, and with each passing hour the silence grew louder. What had once felt like control now felt like exposure. The house no longer felt neutral, it felt like an accusation. This is the part of the story where the audience usually expects chaos, panic, a crack, but none came, not yet. Matthew remained composed, helpful, concerned. The image of a man trapped in uncertainty, waiting for answers just like everyone else. And that is what made this case so chilling, because the crime was never meant to be loud. It was meant to disappear, to dissolve into routine, to be swallowed by normalcy. But crimes built on silence leave echoes. And as night returned, bringing with it the same quiet that had started everything, something shifted. A realization flickered beneath Matthew's calm exterior. Not fear, not guilt, something else. The understanding that silence does not forget, it waits. And somewhere in that waiting, the shadow he believed he had buried was already beginning to stretch. Everything looked right. And that was the problem. The room told a story that felt finished before anyone had finished reading it. No overturned furniture, no shattered glass, no signs of panic frozen in place, just stillness, order, the kind of quiet that suggested nothing had gone wrong, only that something had ended. On paper it was clean. Too clean. Investigators moved carefully, slow footsteps echoing against floors that hadn't been disturbed. They scanned surfaces, took notes, photographed angles. Nothing jumped out, nothing screamed violence. The absence of chaos suggested exactly what Matthew wanted it to suggest: an accident, a tragic turn of events, a life lost without intention. Matthew watched it all from a distance, not hiding, not interfering, present but measured. He understood systems. He trusted them. Trusted that procedures would do what they always do: classify, label, move on. He answered questions with calm precision, offered details without being asked, appeared cooperative, concerned, almost rehearsed. Reports were filed. Initial conclusions leaned gently toward explanation rather than accusation. The narrative began forming on its own, just as he had planned. And for a brief moment, Matthew allowed himself to believe it was working. Then something shifted. Not suspicion. Not yet. Just a hesitation so subtle it could barely be named. An investigator reread a line in his notes. Another glanced back at the scene one more time before leaving the room. A pause that lingered half a second longer than it should have. Doubt doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, like a draft through a closed door. The problem with perfection is that it doesn't exist in real life. Humans are messy, emotional, inconsistent, and when a situation lacks those qualities, it stands out. Not because it looks wrong, but because it looks staged. The timeline made sense, but only just. The details aligned, but too neatly. Matthew's account flowed smoothly without the stumbles that usually accompany shock. His reactions came at the right moments, but they arrived with precision. Like cues in a script, investigators noticed. They didn't say anything. They rarely do. They simply filed the feeling away. Friends and family gathered in small clusters, whispering questions they didn't yet dare to ask out loud. Where was she really? How could this happen without anyone noticing? Matthew stayed close, offering comfort, keeping his voice low, but something about him felt different now. His answers grew shorter, his expressions tighter. The calm that once felt natural began to feel maintained, as if it required effort, as if it could slip. Confidence has a smell. Seasoned investigators know it well. It's not arrogance, it's certainty. The kind that leaves no room for doubt, and doubt, when absent, becomes suspicious. Each interview added weight. Each conversation stretched longer than Matthew expected. The questions repeated, the same ones asked again in slightly different ways. When did you last see her? What was your relationship like recently? Did anything seem off? Matthew had planned for the questions. He had not planned for the waiting. Time passed differently now. Slower. He felt it in the long nights, the empty spaces where routine used to live. Silence pressed in again, but this time it wasn't neutral. It felt observant, judgmental. Rumors surfaced, quiet ones, hints of tension in the marriage, mentions of arguments that never quite resolved. Someone recalled seeing Matthew with another woman. Someone else mentioned late nights, unexplained absences, nothing concrete, but nothing disappeared once it was spoken. Betrayal doesn't need proof to cast a shadow. It only needs possibility. Investigators circled back, asked follow-up questions, rechecked details that had already been documented. They weren't accusing him, not openly, but the tone had changed, less sympathetic, more precise. Matthew noticed. He began correcting himself, clarifying statements that didn't need clarification, offering information no one asked for, small things, human things, but in a case built on the belief that he was above human error, those things mattered. One afternoon, an investigator asked him to repeat his account of the night. Matthew told it the same way he always did. But this time there was a pause, just a fraction too long between sentences, enough to be felt, not heard. Eyes met, then looked away. Time does this to people. It erodes certainty.
We know
It
you were there,
exposes
Matthew.
cracks.
Just
The
tell us
longer
what happened.
truth is allowed to
I didn't
exist,
do
the more
anything.
space it has
I
to
swear.
breathe. This is where so-called perfect murders begin to unravel, not with a confession, not with a single piece of evidence, but with the slow accumulation of doubt. The realization that no matter how carefully you plan, you cannot control perception. Matthew started sleeping less, eating less, his patience thinned. The calm he had relied on now required constant maintenance. One slip, one wrong reaction, and the mask could fall, and beneath it something waited. The system he had trusted was no longer moving past him. It was circling, quietly, methodically. The questions hadn't stopped. They were only becoming sharper. As days stretched into weeks, Matthew felt it clearly for the first time, not panic, not guilt, but something colder. The understanding that time was no longer on his side, and somewhere in the silence between questions, the truth was beginning to move. The moment everything changed didn't come with sirens or shouting. It came with silence, the kind that settles into a room and refuses to leave. A question asked again, a file reopened, a detail revisited that everyone thought was already settled. That's how certainty begins to die. An investigator sat at a desk late one evening rereading Matthew Garner's statement for the third time. Nothing new on the page, same words, same order, but something felt off. Too smooth, too consistent. Real memories stumble, they hesitate, they circle back on themselves. This one didn't, so they looked again, at timelines, at phone records, at small behavioral notes scribbled in margins. They weren't chasing a story anymore. They were chasing a person. Patterns began to form, not loud ones, subtle ones. The way Matthew answered emotional questions faster than factual ones. The way his tone shifted when his marriage was mentioned. The way he spoke about his missing spouse as if she were already gone. Behavior leaves residue. And guilt, no matter how carefully hidden, always leaves a trace. When investigators called Matthew back in, the room felt different. Same walls, same chairs. But the air had weight now. They didn't accuse him. They didn't raise their voices. They simply asked him to walk through the night again. Matthew began confidently. He always did, but halfway through it happened. A pause, just a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but moments matter. Silence speaks. That pause said everything. Eyes lifted. Pen stopped moving. No one rushed to fill the gap. They let it sit, let it stretch, let Matthew feel it, and in that space his certainty cracked. He recovered quickly, too quickly, offered an explanation, then another, adjusted his timeline by minutes, corrected himself without being prompted. Each attempt to regain control only made it clearer that he was losing it. What followed was not a confession, it was resistance, calm on the surface, chaos underneath. Matthew rationalized, explained, reframed. He spoke about stress, about misunderstanding, about grief affecting memory. He built alternative explanations with the same care he once used to build the crime itself. But this time the structure wouldn't hold. The walls were closing in, not physically, mentally. Sleep abandoned him. Nights stretched endlessly, filled with replayed conversations and imagined outcomes. He listened for sounds that weren't there. Read meaning into every knock, every phone call, every unfamiliar car slowing outside his home. Confidence, once effortless, now required energy. Control slipped in small ways, a sharp response here, an emotional outburst there. He grew impatient with questions he had answered before, frustrated that the world wouldn't move on the way it was supposed to. That's when the realization began to form, slowly, painfully. The perfect murder was never perfect. It only felt that way from the inside, from the narrow perspective of someone who underestimated the persistence of truth. Matthew had believed intelligence could shield him, that planning could outpace reality, that if the story made sense, no one would look deeper. But truth doesn't care about stories, it waits. Investigators did what they do best. They stopped pushing and started listening. They compared statements made weeks apart, noted emotional inconsistencies, the subtle shift from concern to detachment, from uncertainty to certainty. Motive sharpened. The marriage, once described as stable, began to look strained. Affairs surfaced, quiet ones. Messages deleted but not erased. Meetings explained away until they weren't. Betrayal slipped into focus, not just of a spouse but of trust. The narrative Matthew had built began collapsing under its own weight. Each new explanation contradicted the last. Each attempt to stay ahead only pushed him further behind. Then came the moment he couldn't outrun. An investigator placed a single document on the table, not dramatic, not sensational, just undeniable. A piece of evidence that aligned too cleanly with what they already suspected. Matthew stared at it longer than he meant to, and in that stare everything changed. He understood then, fully, not emotionally but intellectually, the way he had always processed things. He was no longer ahead of the story, he was inside it, trapped by it. The crime he believed would free him had done the opposite. It had locked him into a future defined entirely by the worst thing he had ever done. There was no version of this story where he walked away untouched. Control was gone. What remained was fear, not of punishment, but of exposure, of being seen clearly, of the carefully constructed image finally dissolving under the weight of truth. Matthew said nothing more that day. He didn't need to. The silence had already spoken for him. As he left the room, investigators watched him go. They didn't celebrate. They didn't smile. They knew what this moment meant. The end was approaching, but it wouldn't be quick or easy. Truth rarely is. And somewhere between the door closing behind him and the sound of footsteps fading down the hall, Matthew realized the final devastating truth. The perfect murder doesn't exist, and the consequences were only just beginning. The verdict came down in a quiet room. No gasps, no dramatic collapse, just words spoken calmly, deliberately, sealing a future that could no longer be edited or explained away. Guilty. In the end, the case was not remembered for its brilliance but for its arrogance. Matthew Garner's name did not become shorthand for a flawless crime. It became a warning, a reminder of what happens when someone mistakes intelligence for invincibility. The courtroom felt heavy in the moments that followed. Not loud, not chaotic, heavy. The kind of weight that settles into people's shoulders and stays there. Matthew stood still as the words sank in, his expression controlled, his posture straight. But something had left him, something essential. The court didn't just judge what he did. It judged why he did it, every calculated step, every choice made in advance, every lie delivered calmly with confidence. The belief that planning could erase morality, that intelligence could grant immunity from consequence, that if a crime looked clean enough, the truth would simply accept defeat. It didn't. The judge spoke about intent, about forethought, about betrayal that began long before the crime itself, about a missing spouse whose absence had been explained away as circumstance, when in reality it was the result of cold decision-making. Matthew listened. He always listened. But this time there was nothing left to calculate. For the victim's loved ones, the verdict brought no relief that could ever be called complete. Justice does not return voices to empty rooms. It does not refill spaces at dinner tables. It does not undo birthdays missed or futures erased. What it does is something quieter. It names the truth. For months, reality had been bent. softened, replaced by careful narratives and plausible explanations. Now those illusions collapsed. The truth stood alone, unembellished and undeniable, and while it hurt, it also grounded them, gave shape to grief, gave meaning to loss. In the audience there were tears, not dramatic ones, silent
Matthew
ones,
Garner,
tears
on
that
the
had been
charge of
waiting
which you
for
were
permission
convicted,
to fall.
this court
Matthew
sentences
was
you to
sentenced.
25 years to life in
Years
state
spoken
prison.
aloud, one after another, transforming abstract time into something solid, something heavy, something final. As he was led away, there were no last words, no outburst, no denial, just silence. And in that silence lived the final consequence. He lost his freedom, yes, but that was not the deepest loss. He lost the illusion that he was different, smarter, untouchable. He lost the belief that he could outthink the oldest rule humanity has ever known, that action's echo. In the end, Matthew was not exceptional, he was human, and humanity leaves traces, inconsistencies, patterns, emotional residue that no amount of planning can erase. There is no such thing as the perfect murder because perfection requires complete control over reality, over time, over people, over emotion, and those things do not bend, they resist, they leak, they surface. Truth does not need urgency, it is patient. This is why true crime continues to haunt us. Not because of the violence itself, but because of what it reveals. The dangerous lie that we can outthink morality, that intelligence alone is enough to justify harm, that consequences are negotiable if the plan is good enough. They are not. Somewhere life continued after the trial, streets filled, days passed, but for those closest to the loss, time moved differently now, slower, marked by absence, and yet anchored by truth. Matthew Garner disappeared into the system he once believed he could manipulate. His name now spoken not with curiosity but with caution. A story told not to admire the planning but to warn against it. Because no matter how carefully you plan, the truth always finds its way to the surface. It may arrive quietly, slowly, in pieces, but it arrives. There is no perfect murder, only consequences waiting patiently to be discovered. And even now, long after the verdict, that truth continues to echo softly, relentlessly, reminding us that silence does not erase guilt. It only delays it.